opening line of the First Amendment. Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech. It doesn't say Congress shall grant freedom of speech. It says Congress shall not abridge the freedom of speech. The article "the" indicating an understanding by the framers that freedom of speech was something that pre-existed the country, that everybody there had, whether they were a patriot or Tory, whether they still wished that the king was here, or whether they were glad that the king was gone. Everybody had the freedom of speech. Every single word in those amendments was scrutinized in 1787, even though they weren't added until 4 years later. And that word is included in order to manifest that understanding. I'm sure that your public school teachers didn't teach you that. So your right to think as you wish, your right to develop your own personality as you wish. I've often told Bill O'Reilly he should be most grateful for that right. Your right to think as you wish, to say what you think, to publish what you say, your right to worship or not to worship, your right to keep and own a gun, which, my friends, is not the right to shoot at a deer. It's the right to shoot at the government if it is taken over by tyrants. We'll pass through the Washington years, and we're in John Adams' presidency. His vice president is Thomas Jefferson. Now, they didn't speak to each other. They didn't speak in the 4 years that Adams was president and Jefferson was vice president. You remember how people were elected in those days. Everybody ran for president. Whoever finished first became president. Whoever finished second became vice president. Could you imagine if we had this in the modern era? Well, we don't. We have the 12th Amendment, which changes that. So the disputed election in 1800, when Jefferson would beat Adams, it was decided by the House of Representatives. But in 1796, Adams beats Jefferson. So things are going along pretty well until there appears in the countryside something that today is inconceivable. It was fear of the French. What the heck were they worried about? They were worried that Jefferson's friends in France would come to the United States, would become American citizens, and would vote out of office the big government federalists, the George Washington, John Adams, Alexander Hamilton, big government, we love debt, sound familiar, political party that was running all three branches of the government, because Washington had appointed Federalist judges and Adams continued to do the same. The very, very famous Marbury against Madison case has to do with the appointment of a very low-level Federalist judge by John Adams. So anyway, they decide we're going to take care of this problem by enacting the Alien and Sedition Acts. And the Alien and Sedition Acts would basically say, we have open borders and we can use people here. So if you want to come, come. But if you're French, you have to wait 14 years before you can become a citizen and vote. Then they added a most lamentable and unfortunate section to the Alien and Sedition Acts, the sedition part of it, which basically said, if you articulate words that bring the president or the Congress or the government in general into disrepute, you can be prosecuted and convicted and incarcerated for 2 years. Well, by the way, note who's missing from that list. President, Congress, government. The vice president is missing. Jefferson didn't want the freedom from criticism. He couldn't care less what they said about him, and said if he ever became president and this monstrosity was the law, he wouldn't enforce it. So question, how did the same generation, in some cases the very same human beings who wrote, Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech, enact a law that did abridge the freedom of speech? I once put this question to my dear friend Lou Rockwell, and he said to me, the answer is what St. Augustine called libido dominandi. No, not that kind of libido, Lou. This is the lust to dominate. And with the exception of giants in our midst, like Ron Paul, this is a lust that afflicts almost everybody in the government. They want to use the power of the government to take away our freedoms, to enhance their own longevity and tenure in power, and tell us how to live. So were they phonies when they wrote, Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech, or did something happen to them by the time they made certain freedoms of certain speeches susceptible to prosecution? And Congressman Matthew Lyons was a Ron Paul type precursor who represented Vermont in the House of Representatives. He was an anti-federalist, a small government Jeffersonian, if you will. And he decided to test the limits of the Alien and Sedition Acts, and he did so by insulting the president. Now, the president, John Adams, had a couple of aberrations, one of which, aside from his political philosophy, was that he could be seen walking around Philadelphia and eventually in Washington in a purple robe. And sometimes Mrs. Adams would sew gold epaulets on the shoulders of the robe, sort of hinting a little bit of an affliction to royalty. John Adams also had a problem that afflicts a lot of middle-aged men. He had a problem with his waistline. So Congressman Lyons decided he would challenge how serious the government was with the Alien and Sedition Acts by mocking the president's waistline. So in a public place, not on the floor of the House, because he'd be immune from prosecution for what he says on the floor. There's a long and interesting history behind that of British kings who executed members of Parliament because of what they said in the Parliament. But somewhere in a public place, Congressman Lyons referred to the President of the United States of America as his rotundity. And for that, Congressman Lyons was prosecuted in a federal court in Boston, was convicted of violating the Alien and Sedition Acts, and was sentenced to 2 years in a subterranean federal jail in a mountain in western Massachusetts. Now, if you are from Hudson County, New Jersey, or Chicago, or Boston, or New Orleans, you'll appreciate the second half of this Congressman Lyons story, because he ran for re-election to the Congress from his jail cell. And he won. By the time he gets out of jail as a re-elected congressman, he goes to Washington. His nemesis, John Adams, is in retirement, and the great Thomas Jefferson is president.